Junto Nakatani's game begins and ends with his lead hand. It's the bedrock of his boxing skill, be it offensively or defensively. As a southpaw, the majority of Nakatani's work is done in the open stance, or orthodox versus southpaw. In the open stance, both fighters' lead hands are aligned, so the jab lane is naturally occupied by the opposing glove. To circumvent this, fighters will often try and probe over their opponent's lead hand so as to win the lane and begin to establish a jab. When both fighters do this, it's called a jab joust, with the lead hands typically jockeying for top hand position over the other. More educated fighters like Junto take this a step further. While probing can be considered relatively safe due to providing punch traffic, in the system of boxing, any movement taking your glove away from your guard still presents an opportunity, albeit small, for the opponent to land. Typically, finding the timing for and then countering probes can be a bit difficult due to that small window of vulnerability, but by conditioning his opponents to probe with him, he can then attack on the timing of which his opponent is expecting to match an outstretched lead hand probe or just after. Junto's lead hand probes benefit him in a few more ways. Boxing can be simplified to a game of percentages. In any given situation, the opponent has certain percentages or a likelihood to throw a certain punch at a certain time. Fighters at the highest level who use controls or punch traffic can directly affect these percentages by taking a glove or glove away or otherwise hindering its path to target. In Junto's case, constantly probing the jab lane makes the likelihood that the opponent throws the lead hand much lower, since they must contend with Junto's. Instead, the likelihood that the opponent throws the rear hand, which is free from any hindrance or control, goes up. So Junto will often anticipate the rear hand as he's probing and controlling, making it much easier to counter on his timing. The lead hand is a physical barrier and a tripwire of sorts. The opponent has to knock down the barrier or jump through the barrier. Either way, he hits the tripwire, which alerts Junto to evade with footwork and defend. Or go into step back counters. Junto's constant lead hand probes not only clog the lane, but by proxy presents an obstacle filling the space between himself and his opponent. At 5'8" with a 68.5-inch wingspan, Junto is taller and longer on average than the majority of opponents at or around the weight classes where he campaigns, so the outstretched probe arm presents a considerable hurdle for his opponents looking to close distance. Combining this with small reverse steps back makes Junto very effective at controlling distance. If the lead hand creates a barrier of entry for his opponents, then naturally, taking away said lead hand and freeing the space between himself and his opponent will make them much more likely to attack on that timing. Holstering the lead hand temporarily and waiting presents a defensive look to his opponents while also taking away the largest deterrent for closing distance. So when that opponent then commits to an attack, Junto is already waiting with counterpunches. The opponent becomes tired of Nakatani's games and stops engaging with the lead hand jab joust. Without an obstacle impeding his path, Nakatani would unhappily establish a stiff power jab. And then use those jabs or jab feints to draw out defensive reactions or occupy a glove and attack elsewhere, often with a devastating left cross or hook.
Yeah, keeping him occupied, keeping him looking at that hand, and then he boom, it explodes with the backhand. That's the hand that he really wants to land. Nakatani, the left hand.
That he may also follow with explosive swivel jabs and lead hand hooks. To make the rear hand more powerful, Junto will utilize a hop step, which allows him to close distance after pushing off the rear leg into a balanced or rear foot heavy stance, which loads the rear hand, as opposed to the pendulum step that pushes forward and lands lead foot heavy, making sure to get his lead foot on the outside of his opponent's to line up the rear hand. Since Junto sets up the hop step 1-2 with the pendulum step jab, if the opponent is attempting to counter the pendulum step instead of the next phase, which is the hop step, Junto goes into jab traps. Junto will simply begin to use throwaway jabs or probes to bait out those counters and then counter the counter. These concepts, lead hand probing, clogging punch lanes, controlling distance, etc., make up the principles of the long guard, which Junto often uses for defense or when controlling distance. Here, we rope in the rear hand as it becomes positioned in the punch lane of the opponent's rear hand in the open stance. With both punch lanes clogged, for the same reasons previously stated, it becomes especially difficult to land meaningful punches on Nakatani. On the step out with the long guard, Nakatani can then easily choose to turn the outstretched lead hand into controls to off-balance or blind his opponent, or a counter jab or step back counter as his opponent advances with offense. Nakatani gets backed onto the ropes, where the opponent gets within the guard. Nakatani knows how to smother and clinch to shut down the engagement or angle out the center ring. As Junto controls distance, he'll begin to turn that into a trap itself. By stepping out of range, he simply waits for his opponent to come forward to make up the distance lost by Junto's disengagement. Upon entering mid-range, before or just after their foot hits the canvas, Nakatani is already attacking while they're momentarily off balance. Or it suddenly baits offense from too far out, which makes seeing, opening, and countering easier. If he's on the back foot, he'll use lateral traps, simply setting his feet after moving laterally and attacking as his opponents attempt to match the new angle and their base is momentarily broken. All of these skills Nakatani uses are not mutually exclusive, and he will mix, match, and combine them all to become an extremely formidable fighter from mid-range to outside. A fighter worthy of his pound-for-pound ranking, one of the most skilled in the world, and certainly one of the most skilled Japan has ever seen. Junto Big Bang Nakatani.